Somewhere in the middle of the Gulf of Alaska, several hundred miles from the nearest piece of land, there's a fish about the length of your forearm moving through water that's 2 miles deep underneath it. Nothing about it looks like a story yet. It's silver, blunt through the nose, heavy across the shoulder, and it's traveling inside a loose school of thousands, doing the same unremarkable thing it's doing, which is swimming and eating and getting bigger. If you could lift it out of the water right now, you'd be holding one of the healthiest animals in the North Pacific. Dense muscle all the way through. A body carrying something close to 1/10 of its own weight in stored fat, sometimes more, depending on how good the feeding has been. Gills that have been stripping salt out of its bloodstream every second of every day for 3 years without a break. That fish has not seen fresh water since it was roughly the size of your finger. And in about 90 days, it's going to be dead. Not caught. Not eaten by anything. Dead in maybe 6 inches of water, in a gravel creek narrow enough to step across, in a forest a very long way from where it's swimming right now. Its jaw will have grown into a shape it was not born with. Its stomach will have shrunk to almost nothing. Its skin will be coming apart in patches. Its immune system will have quit weeks earlier, and its skeleton will weigh measurably less than it does today, because the fish will have taken the minerals out of its own bones and spent them. None of that is injury. That's the part that takes a while to absorb. Nothing goes wrong on this trip. Everything that happens to that body is scheduled, written into the animal in advance, triggered on a timetable, and executed by its own hormones with a kind of precision you'd normally associate with development rather than dying. The salmon doesn't break down on the way home. It disassembles itself deliberately, in a specific order, and every piece it takes apart gets spent on something. So the question isn't really how a fish finds a creek from 1,000 miles out in the open ocean, although we'll get to that, because it's a strange piece of biology and it took most of a century to work out. The question is what the trip is actually for, because here's a thing that sits in the background of all of this. And I'd like to put it down now and leave it alone for a while. 40 miles inland from that gravel creek, up a valley this fish will never see, there are Sitka spruce standing 300 feet apart along the water. Old ones. Some of them were already large when the first surveyors came through. And if you take a core out of one of those trees and run the wood through a mass spectrometer, you can find nitrogen in there that did not come from the soil, and did not come from the rain, and did not come from the air. It came out of the ocean. Nobody carried it. No river runs uphill. Something delivered it. And the delivery system was alive. And the delivery system is the animal we're talking about. We'll come back to the tree. For now, start where the animal starts, which is nowhere in particular, in enormous water, at the absolute top of its life. The Gulf of Alaska is not a friendly place to picture because there's nothing in it to hang a picture on. No landmarks. No bottom you can see. Above about 600 feet down, the light is a kind of deep blue-gray that gets weaker with every fathom until it just stops. Below that, nothing. The salmon lives in the top layer of that, mostly in the upper 200 feet, and it moves through a volume of water that has no edges as far as it's concerned. What it does out there is eat. Nothing else, for 3 years. Depending on the species and the year, it's taking krill and amphipods and small squid, herring and sand lance and capelin, and it's doing it in cold, productive, nutrient-rich water that in a good season is one of the most generous feeding grounds on the planet. A sockeye that went to sea weighing less than an ounce will come back weighing 5 or 6 pounds. A chinook can come back weighing 30. And the big ones, the old, rare 4 and 5 ocean year fish, have historically come back weighing more than 80. There's a photograph from the Kenai River of a chinook that weighed 97 pounds. And for decades, that was the number everyone in Alaska measured a big fish against. All of that mass is imported. Every ounce of it was assembled out of the North Pacific, out of marine protein and marine fat, out of nitrogen and phosphorus that had been circulating in salt water for a very long time. Keep that in the back of your mind. It matters later in a way that has nothing to do with fish. Now, the body doing this work is not a general-purpose body. It's specialized down to the cellular level for exactly one chemical environment, and it's worth being precise about what that means because the moment the animal turns around, this specialization becomes the first thing that has to be destroyed. Seawater is saltier than fish blood. Substantially so. So a salmon sitting in the ocean is constantly losing water through its skin and gills by simple osmosis. The water in its tissues is being drawn out toward the saltier fluid around it, all day, every day, forever. It's a slow dehydration that never lets up. A marine fish in the open sea is essentially a body of fresh water leaking into a desert. The way salmon solve this is unglamorous and relentless. They drink. Constantly. A salmon at sea swallows seawater more or less continuously, absorbs the water out of it across the gut wall, and then has to deal with the enormous salt load it just took on board. That job falls to specialized cells in the gill filaments called ionocytes, sometimes called chloride cells, and they are packed with mitochondria, because moving ions against a concentration gradient is expensive and there's no way around the bill. Inside those cells sits a molecular pump. It moves sodium one way and potassium the other, and it burns cellular energy every time it cycles. In a fish living in salt water, that pump is running in a configuration built for excretion. Grab the excess sodium and chloride out of the blood, push it back out into the sea. Keep the internal chemistry inside the narrow band where enzymes and nerves and heart muscle can function. It runs day and night. It has been running day and night since this fish was a smolt. And it isn't the same pump the fish used as a juvenile. That detail is what turns this from plumbing into something stranger. There are different versions of that sodium-potassium pump, coded by different genes, and freshwater fish and saltwater fish express different ones. When a young salmon leaves the river, it doesn't just tolerate salt water. It rebuilds its gills. It switches which gene it's reading. It grows a different population of cells, positions them differently, changes the seals between them, and converts an organ that was absorbing salt into an organ that expels it. That transformation has a name: smoltification. And it's driven by hormones on a photoperiod clock. Lengthening days in spring, thyroid hormones, growth hormone, cortisol, and the whole animal reorganizes. It loses the vertical bars along its flank and turns silver. Its behavior flips from territorial and bottom-oriented to schooling and current-following. Its preference reverses. A fish that avoided salt water now actively seeks it. Which is worth stating plainly because everything that follows runs on that same pattern. A salmon does not have one body over the course of its life. It has several, in sequence, and it demolishes each one to build the next. What happens on the way home is the last and most extreme version of a trick this animal has already performed twice. Out in the Gulf, none of that is visible. The fish looks like a fish. It feeds, it schools, it avoids sea lions and salmon sharks and killer whales. It grows. And then, at some point that is not marked by anything you could see from a boat, it turns around. Nothing decides to turn around. A threshold gets crossed inside an animal that has no idea it's crossing anything. Different species cross it on very different schedules, and the range is wider than you'd expect from fish that all look roughly alike. Pink salmon run on a fixed 2-year clock, so rigid that the odd-year fish and the even-year fish in the same river are effectively two separate populations that never meet, never interbreed, and can differ from each other genetically, even though they spawn in the same gravel 1 year apart. Coho usually go 3. Sockeye commonly 4 or 5. Chinook are the loose ones. A Chinook might come back after 2 years at sea or after 6, And in the same brood year from the same river, you'll get both. What decides? It seems to be some combination of how old the fish is, how much energy it's managed to store, and the light. Day length is the one clock the open ocean reliably provides, and salmon read it. Somewhere in there, a threshold gets met, and a chain of signals starts in the brain that will not stop until the animal is dead. It starts in the hypothalamus, which releases a small signaling molecule that tells the pituitary to start producing gonadotropins. The gonadotropins travel to the ovaries or testes and tell them to start producing sex steroids. The sex steroids go everywhere. And from that moment, the salmon is running a different program. The first thing that changes is where the fish spends its calories. Up to this point, everything the animal ate went into being a bigger animal. More muscle, more fat, more fish. Now that stops. Somatic growth flattens out, and the energy gets redirected into gonad. In a female, the liver starts mass-producing a yolk precursor protein and dumping it into the bloodstream, where it's picked up and packed into developing eggs. The ovaries swell. By the time she's ripe, a female salmon can be carrying eggs equal to something like a fifth of her entire body weight, occasionally more. Imagine a person carrying 30 pounds of cargo that they built out of their own tissue while not eating. She is not at the river yet. She is still hundreds of miles out in salt water, and she is already spending the account. It's the piece I'd emphasize if I were only allowed one sentence about the whole ocean phase. The commitment happens early, and it happens out where there's still food, still safety, still every option available. Long before the fish faces a current or a waterfall or a bear, the irreversible part has already been signed off in the pituitary. Everything downstream of that is just execution. Something else starts moving at the same time, and it's harder to explain because it involves the fish knowing where it is. The school begins to travel with a direction, not randomly, not on a food gradient, on a heading. Sockeye that have spent years distributed across an oceanic area larger than most countries start converging. Fish that were feeding 1,000 miles apart begin arriving off the same stretch of coastline within days of each other. And the arrival is not approximate. In a lot of systems, a given run shows up in the estuary inside a window of a couple of weeks. In the same weeks, year after year, tied to a river the fish has not been in since it was a juvenile. On the Adams River in British Columbia, sockeye run on a 4-year cycle with one dominant year that historically dwarfs the other 3. In a big dominant year, millions of fish come into that one system in a matter of weeks. They were not organized by anything. Nobody led them. They were all just running the same program with the same clock. So, navigation. I want to handle this properly and then set it down because it's the part of the salmon story everybody has heard, and it is not the most extraordinary thing happening in this animal. It's a waypoint. It's the door, and the house is everything behind it. The first serious answer came out of Wisconsin in the early 1950s, from a physiologist named Arthur Hassler. The story he told about it later is that he was hiking in the mountains of Utah, near where he'd grown up, and came around a rock face into a smell. Wet moss, columbine, the particular damp of that specific canyon. And the smell dropped him straight into a childhood memory with a completeness that no photograph would have managed, and he thought, that's it. That's what a salmon is doing. The idea he and his colleague Warren Wisby published was that a young salmon, during the window when it transforms into a smolt and leaves for the sea, learns the odor of its home water. What gets learned is a chemical signature, the specific mix of compounds a particular watershed leaches out of its particular soils and rocks and vegetation and decomposing plant matter. That signature gets fixed in memory at a certain developmental moment, and years later, as an adult, the fish uses it as a target. They tested it the direct way. Adult salmon were captured in a Washington creek at a fork, where the stream split into 2 branches, tagged according to which branch they'd been heading up, and then a portion of them had their nasal openings plugged. Then everything was released downstream and they were allowed to make the choice again. The fish that could smell went back to the branch they'd chosen the first time at a high rate. The fish that couldn't smell distributed themselves between the two branches roughly at random. They were still strong, still motivated, still swimming hard upstream. They just had nothing to steer with. That's a clean result, and it held up. Later work made it much harder to argue with. In one of the neater experiments, researchers exposed young hatchery salmon to a synthetic compound, an artificial odor the fish would never encounter in nature. During the imprinting window, then released them. Years later, when those adults came back into Lake Michigan, streams were dosed with that same synthetic compound, and the imprinted fish piled into the scented streams while the control fish did not. The animals had been given a false home, and they came back to it. So the last stretch is olfactory. That's about as well established as anything in fish biology. The problem is that olfaction only works once you're close. A river plume is detectable for some distance out. River water is lighter and less salty, and it spreads across the surface of the sea for miles. But a salmon coming in from the central Gulf of Alaska is not smelling its creek from out there. There is no chemical gradient stretching across 1,000 miles of open Pacific. Something else gets the fish to the coast, and the coast is not a small target to miss. The strongest current answer is magnetic, and the evidence for it is indirect but very hard to dismiss. The Earth's magnetic field varies in a predictable way over the planet's surface. The angle at which the field lines meet the ground and the total intensity of the field both change with position, and the combination of those two values is different in different places. In principle, that's a coordinate system. Sea turtles use it. Some birds appear to use it. And the proposal for salmon is that they learn the magnetic signature of the river mouth on the way out, the same way they learn the smell, and then use magnetic information to find their way back to that signature from the open ocean. What makes this testable is that the Earth's field drifts, slowly but measurably. The magnetic signature sitting at a given coastline this decade is not sitting there the next. So a group of researchers took decades of fisheries records for Fraser River sockeye, which have a peculiar geography working in their favor. Vancouver Island sits directly in front of the Fraser's mouth, so returning fish have to go around it, either north through Queen Charlotte Strait or south through the Strait of Juan de Fuca. And the fishery has been recording the proportion, taking each route for more than half a century. When the analysis compared that yearly proportion against the drift of the geomagnetic field, the routes the fish chose tracked the field. In years, when the magnetic signature at the northern entrance more closely matched the signature the fish would have imprinted on as juveniles, more fish came around the north. When the southern entrance was the better magnetic match, more came south. That's correlational, and the authors were careful about that. Ocean temperature explained part of the pattern too, but the magnetic effect held up alongside it, and a follow-up study went after the mechanism directly, putting juvenile Chinook that had never left the hatchery into artificial magnetic fields, matching the far northern and far southern edges of their species' oceanic range. The fish oriented differently depending on which field they were in, and they oriented in the directions that would have brought them back toward the middle of that range. They'd never been anywhere. The map was not learned from experience. Some of it appears to be inherited. That's the navigation section. A magnetic map to get to the right coastline, an odor memory to get to the right creek, and possibly a sun compass and a sense of currents filling in the middle, which is honestly still the fuzziest part of the whole picture. Now put it down, because the fish has arrived at the coast, and from here the story stops being about finding anything. The approach to a coast from the water is a chemistry problem before it's a geography problem. You'd think the first sign of land would be the bottom coming up, or the color of the water changing, or the noise of surf. For a salmon, the first sign is dilution. A big river throws an enormous volume of fresh water into the sea. And because fresh water is lighter than salt water, it doesn't mix in immediately. It spreads out across the surface as a lens, a shallow plume that can extend for miles offshore and stays measurably fresher and colder and murkier than the ocean underneath it. The Fraser plume, the Columbia plume, the Copper River plume. They're visible from satellites as pale fans of sediment pushing out into blue water. The fish swims into that lens, and for the first time in years, tastes something it recognizes. We don't know exactly what it recognizes. The best current guess is a profile of dissolved organic compounds, amino acids in particular ratios, decay products from particular vegetation, the leachate of a specific set of rocks and soils and bogs. Whatever the exact chemistry, the fish is now inside a signal, and the signal gets stronger as it moves up the gradient. And that gradient is walking it into the most abrupt physiological problem of its adult life. Because everything I described about the gills a few minutes ago, the constant drinking, the pumping of salt out of the blood, the whole apparatus of surviving in a fluid saltier than yourself, is about to become exactly wrong. Not slightly suboptimal, inverted. In fresh water, the salmon's blood is now the saltier fluid, and osmosis reverses direction completely. Water floods into the body across every permeable surface. Salt leaks out. A fish that spent 3 years dehydrating in the ocean is now at risk of the opposite thing, of swelling and diluting itself into cellular chaos, and its ions bleeding away into a river that's very happy to accept them. So the entire system has to be rebuilt. Again, the fish stops drinking, and that alone is a strange sentence to write about an animal that has drunk continuously since it was a juvenile. The kidneys ramp up and start producing urine in volumes that would be catastrophic on land. Huge amounts of very dilute fluid, because the job now is bailing, not conserving. And the gills reverse function. The ionocytes that were built for excretion get replaced or remodeled into a type built for absorption. The molecular pump switches to the other version of itself coded by a different gene. The junctions between the cells tighten up to stop the leak, and an organ that spent 3 years throwing salt overboard begins scavenging every ion it can find out of the river. That transition takes days, not minutes. And that's the reason for something you can watch from a bridge at the right time of year, which is salmon sitting in the estuary, doing apparently nothing. They mill, they hold in the brackish layer, moving up on the flood tide and dropping back on the ebb, working the gradient, spending time in half-strength water before committing to the full change. It looks like hesitation, and it functions like decompression. The animal is retooling its own gills in a transition zone, and it will not survive going straight from ocean into a river without doing it. There's another change happening in the same days, and this one is quieter and much more consequential. The salmon stops eating. There's no shortage of food out there. Estuaries are among the richest feeding areas on any coastline. It stops because the machinery for eating is being taken apart. Stomach acid production falls off. The lining of the gut thins. The pyloric caeca, those finger-like pouches off the intestine where a huge amount of a fish's absorption happens, shrink. In salmon that have been in fresh water for weeks, the digestive tract can be reduced to a fraction of its ocean size, a slack, empty tube running the length of an animal that's still swimming 10 or 15 miles a day. You can still catch them on a lure in the river. That confuses people, and it's worth explaining, because it looks like feeding while being something else entirely. A salmon in fresh water will strike at a bright object out of aggression, territoriality, or reflex. The attack behavior is still wired in and still fires. But almost nothing is going down that gut and being used. And if you open the stomach of a river-caught fish, it's usually empty and collapsed, which means that from roughly the moment it crosses the salt line, the salmon is a closed system. I want to be exact about how severe that is. Every calorie that fish will spend for the rest of its life has already been acquired. Every mile of upstream swimming, every leap, every hour of holding station in a current, every ounce of egg or milt, every day of digging gravel, every day of guarding a nest, all of it comes out of a fuel tank that was sealed shut in the estuary and will never be reopened. There's no resupply. There's no bad day that can be made up for tomorrow. If the river is high, if the water is warm, if the fish takes a wrong turn and loses 4 days, that comes out of the same tank, and the tank has to reach the gravel with enough left to reproduce. The closest thing I can think of, mechanically, is a multi-stage rocket. A Saturn V didn't carry its first stage to the moon. It burned it, dropped it in the Atlantic, and kept going lighter. Then it burned the second stage and dropped that. Every part of that vehicle that had finished its job became dead weight and got discarded, and the thing that finally touched down was a fraction of what left the pad. A salmon does the same accounting, except it can't drop anything into the ocean. It has to consume its own stages from the inside and carry the ashes. By the time it clears the last of the brackish water, the changes are already visible if you know what you're looking at. The silver is going. That mirror finish on an ocean salmon comes from crystals of guanine in the skin, and it's camouflage for open water, where looking like nothing at all is the only cover available. In the river, that's useless, and it starts to fade. Underneath it, in sockeye, the change is dramatic. The muscle and skin pigments begin to reorganize, and the animal that went into the estuary looking like a chrome bar will come out of the next few weeks deep red with a green head. The pigment doing that is astaxanthin, a carotenoid the fish got from eating krill and other crustaceans at sea, and which it has been storing in its flesh. It's the compound that makes salmon meat orange in the first place. On the way upriver, a large share of it is pulled out of the muscle and moved into the skin and, more importantly, into the eggs, which is a small thing that says a great deal about what's happening. That pigment was in the muscle. Now it's in the eggs. It was never really the fish's. It was in transit. Everything past the salt line runs on that logic. There's a line in every river system where the tide stops mattering. And once a salmon is above it, the water is doing exactly one thing forever, which is coming toward it. An ocean is neutral. It has currents, but a fish can drift, hold, hang in a layer, and cost itself almost nothing. A river never offers that. Every second a salmon spends in a river, it is either swimming or losing ground. There's no idle. Even the resting is work. A fish tucked into the slack water behind a boulder is still finning to hold position, still burning through a tank that cannot be refilled. And that's what makes the second problem different. The osmotic one was solved in the estuary in a matter of days. The metabolic one has no solution. It's a subtraction problem that runs until it hits zero. And the only question is where the fish is standing when it does. The muscle doing the work comes in two kinds, and the distinction is easy to see the next time you look at a salmon fillet. Along the flank, just under the skin, there's a darker strip. That's red muscle. It's dense with mitochondria and blood supply and myoglobin. It burns fat with oxygen. It's slow. It's efficient. And it's what a salmon cruises on. It can run all day. The rest, the pale bulk of the fish, the part people actually eat, is white muscle. White muscle is for emergencies. It's fast, it's powerful, and it works anaerobically, which means it doesn't wait for oxygen and doesn't care about efficiency. It burns stored glycogen and floods the tissue with lactate as a byproduct. A salmon can fire its white muscle and produce a burst of acceleration that will shove it through water no cruising muscle could handle, and it will pay for that burst for hours. Clearing lactate out of a fish's system after a hard anaerobic effort isn't a matter of catching its breath. It's a long, slow chemical cleanup. And while it's happening, the fish's capacity for the next burst is reduced. so the ascent becomes a management problem. Cruise where you can, burst only where you must, and every place you're forced to burst, you've spent something you won't get back. And the distances are not modest. The extreme case in North America is the Yukon. Chinook salmon come in from the Bering Sea and run up the Yukon River into the interior, and the farthest traveling of them keep going into the headwater tributaries in Canada, on the order of 2,000 river miles from the sea. A journey that takes them roughly 2 months of continuous upstream swimming without a single meal. Those fish are famous in the fishing trade for their fat content, and the reason is straightforward accounting. A Chinook that has to cross a continent's worth of river before it can spawn cannot leave the ocean with a normal fuel load. The Yukon fish load up more than others do, and it shows in the flesh. In Idaho, there's a run that does the same thing vertically. Sockeye salmon return from the Pacific up the Columbia, and then the Snake, and finally into the Sawtooth Valley, to a place called Redfish Lake, named, historically, for what the shoreline looked like when the fish arrived. That trip is roughly 900 miles inland and climbs to about 6,500 feet above sea level, which makes it the longest and highest sockeye migration anywhere. The fish also have to pass 8 major dams on the way, which is a separate conversation and a bleak one. That run came very close to ending. In 1992, exactly 1 sockeye returned to Redfish Lake. 1 fish. Somebody nicknamed him Lonesome Larry, and his taxidermied body ended up in the Idaho governor's office, which is the kind of detail that would seem heavy-handed in fiction. The entire genetic line of Snake River sockeye was kept going through a captive broodstock program built around a handful of surviving animals, and it is still on life support today. On the Fraser in British Columbia, the early Stewart run travels something over 600 miles upstream and climbs roughly the height of a substantial mountain to reach its spawning tributaries, and it does it in the hottest part of the summer. Now the accounting gets interesting, because you can watch natural selection doing arithmetic here. Sockeye populations that have to travel farther and climb higher do not simply try harder. They're built differently before they ever enter the river. Research on Fraser sockeye has found that the long-distance, high-elevation populations show up at the river mouth with more stored energy per unit of body mass and with more streamlined, less exaggerated body shapes than the populations that only have to run a short way inland. The fish going a long way are packed heavier and shaped sleeker. The fish that only have to go 20 miles can afford to be extravagant. That's a trade-off written into the body plan of each population separately, tuned to the specific river it evolved in. It's one of the reasons the word salmon is misleading. There isn't one animal here. There are thousands of locally calibrated populations, each one solving its own river, each one carrying a different budget. And regardless of the budget, the burn proceeds in a specific order. Fat goes first. Lipid is the preferred fuel. It's energy dense. It's the reason the fish stored it in the first place. And the cruising muscle is built to run on it. Through the lower and middle river, that's mostly what's being spent. And the fish's fat reserves fall steadily and predictably with distance covered. Then, the fat starts running out. When it does, the animal switches to protein. And there's only one place to get protein. It begins breaking down its own muscle and using the amino acids as fuel. In the classic studies of Fraser sockeye energetics, fish arriving on the spawning grounds had consumed the overwhelming majority of their stored fat, the great bulk of it, and a substantial share of their body protein along with it. By the end, these animals have taken apart a meaningful fraction of the very tissue that's propelling them. Read that as a machine, and it stops making sense. An engine that consumes its own cylinders is a bad engine. It has a defined endpoint, and the endpoint is failure. Read it as a delivery vehicle, and it makes perfect sense. The muscle is fuel that happens to be temporarily shaped like a swimming apparatus, and the moment its structural job is finished, its chemical value gets extracted and moved into the payload, which sets up the ugly geometry of the rest of the trip. Rivers get harder as you go up. That's not a coincidence of any particular watershed. It's just what gravity does. The lower river is wide and slow and deep, and the upper river is narrow and steep and fast, with the rapids and the chutes and the falls concentrated toward the top. Meanwhile, the fish's power output is falling with every mile. So the difficulty curve and the capability curve are running in opposite directions, and they cross somewhere. For a lot of individual fish, they cross too early. A waterfall is the clearest version of the problem, so start there. Because the mechanics of a salmon getting over one are stranger than the footage suggests. Everybody has seen the image. Fish in the air, water everywhere, a bear standing in the froth waiting. What the image doesn't show is that the fish is not jumping out of still water. It can't. A salmon has no legs, nothing to push off, no purchase on anything solid. All it has is a tail, and the water that tail is pushing against, and once the fish leaves the surface, it's a projectile, with no further control over its trajectory. Everything is decided in the last few feet underwater. The pool at the bottom of the falls, in other words, is doing half the work. When falling water hits a plunge pool, it drives downward and then rolls back up. And just downstream of the impact, there's a place where the water is moving upward with real force, a standing wave, a hydraulic boil. Salmon leap out of that. They position themselves in the rising water, accelerate into it, and use the upward velocity of the water column as part of their own launch. This was worked out in Scotland in the 1950s and 60s, in a set of observations that are still the foundation of how fish passes get designed, and the practical consequence is exact. The depth and shape of the pool below a falls determines whether the falls is passable at all. Too shallow, and there's no standing wave. And no amount of fish determination produces a jump. Too much flow, and the wave is in the wrong place. Fish passage engineers use rules of thumb about needing a plunge pool at least as deep as the drop is high. And those rules exist because the alternative is building a structure that stops a run of salmon dead for a century. When conditions are right, the leaps are remarkable. Reliable reports put the best of them somewhere around 10 or 11 feet of vertical gain, and those are exceptional animals in exceptional water. Most successful leaps are far smaller. Brooks Falls in Katmai, the place in every documentary, is about 6 feet high, and even that stops a substantial number of fish on any given attempt. And this is where the second problem and the third problem meet. Every leap is white muscle. Every leap is anaerobic, expensive, and followed by a lactate debt. A fish that clears a falls on the first attempt has spent 1 unit of a currency it can't earn. A fish that hits the lip and gets washed back has spent the same unit and gained nothing, and now has to recover in the turbulence at the base before it can try again. And while it recovers, it's holding position against the current, which also costs, and it's sitting in the one place in the entire river where every predator in the watershed knows to stand. That's not a coincidence either. Obstacles concentrate salmon, and predators concentrate at obstacles. Brown bears at Brooks Falls, bald eagles on the gravel bars, gulls, otters, wolves in some systems. A run of salmon is a moving pulse of food, and the falls is where the pulse slows down. The larger obstacles have a different character, and there's one on the Fraser that shows what happens when the geometry goes wrong. Hell's Gate is a place where the entire Fraser River, a river draining a region the size of a small country, squeezes through a gorge, maybe 110 feet across. The water goes through there at a velocity that is difficult to describe in a way that sounds real. It was always a hard passage. It was passable. Then, during railway construction in 1913 and 1914, rock was blasted and dumped into the canyon, and the channel narrowed further. The velocity went up, and the migration effectively stopped. Fish massed below the constriction and could not get through, and the sockeye runs of the Fraser, one of the great salmon systems on Earth, collapsed. Not for a season, for generations. Fishways were finally engineered into the canyon walls in the 1940s to give the fish slower water to climb through, and they helped enormously. And even so, some of those upriver runs have never recovered to what the records describe from before the slide. I find that one of the more sobering facts in the whole subject: the animal survived ice ages. It survived the Pleistocene rerouting of entire drainages. It got stopped by a construction project. For most fish in most rivers, though, the mechanical problem isn't a falls or a canyon, it's the grind. Miles of moderate current, day after day, at a pace that's been measured in a lot of systems and typically works out to somewhere in the range of a few dozen miles a day when the fish is moving well. In a big river, the animal works the margins, where friction against the bank and the bottom slows the water down, and it hunts for eddies and seams and slack pockets behind obstructions the way a cyclist hunts for a wheel to sit behind. The efficient route upstream is a chain of small refuges, and running underneath all of that is temperature, which has quietly become the most dangerous variable in the entire migration. Salmon are cold water animals with a narrow operating band. And here's the part that took researchers a long time to demonstrate properly. The band is different for different populations of the same species in the same river. A group of physiologists working on Fraser sockeye measured the aerobic capacity of fish from several different runs across a range of water temperatures. Essentially, how much oxygen each population could deliver to its muscles above the baseline needed just to stay alive. That surplus is what swimming comes out of. Each population had a peak, and each population's peak sat close to the temperature its own tributary historically ran at during its own migration window. Fish from a hot, short, late summer run performed best warm. Fish from a cool headwater run performed best cool. One population, from a system with wildly variable conditions, had a much broader tolerance than the rest, which fits. That's the run that had to be robust. Push a population past its own optimum, and the surplus starts to fall away. The heart can't move enough oxygen, the aerobic scope narrows, and the fish loses the ability to do the very work the river is demanding of it. Push it further, and it stops being about performance and becomes about survival. The Fraser in summer is now running warmer than it did when those runs were established. The long-term records show a rise of a few degrees Fahrenheit over the past 70 years, with the extreme years getting more extreme. And in the hot years, fisheries managers have documented something they call en route mortality. Fish that entered the river in good condition were counted going in and simply never arrived. Not caught, not diverted. They died in the river, in numbers that in the worst years have run into the millions. There's a specific cruelty in the timing of that, because the salmon has no ability to wait. It can't sit in the estuary for 3 weeks until the heat wave breaks. The clock inside it is already running. Its gonads are already maturing. Its fuel is already burning at a rate that heat only accelerates. And if it delays, it arrives too late and too empty to spawn, regardless. It has to go into the hot water. The program doesn't have a pause. And while all this is happening, the current, the falls, the heat, the emptying tank, the animal's own body has started to change shape. If you photographed a sockeye at the mouth of the Fraser and photographed the same fish 3 weeks later in a headwater tributary, most people would not accept that they were looking at one animal. The first photograph is a torpedo, chrome sides, blue-green back, a small clean head, a shape that exists to move through open water with the least possible drag. The second photograph is scarlet. The head has gone dark green, almost olive black, and it's grown longer and heavier. The jaws don't close properly anymore. The lower one has curled upward into a hook, and the upper one has developed a matching notch to receive it. The teeth are bigger. The back has risen into a ridge. The whole outline of the fish has deepened and roughened, and the skin has gone from a mirror to something closer to leather. Every bit of that is construction work, and it happens fast. A matter of weeks, in an animal that has not eaten in all that time and is simultaneously swimming several hundred miles upstream against current. Start with the jaw, because the jaw is the piece that gives the whole thing away. That hooked lower jaw has a name. It's called a kype, and it grows on males of most salmon species as they approach spawning. And when researchers actually sectioned it and looked at what it's made of, it turned out not to be ordinary bone in the ordinary sense. Normal bone in a fish is laid down slowly over seasons, in an orderly way. The kype is a specialized skeletal tissue that gets thrown up at speed. A fast, coarse, purpose-built structure, closer in character to something an embryo makes than to something an adult maintains. And here is the detail that should stop you, because it took me a while to accept it. In Atlantic salmon, which is the one salmon species where a meaningful number of individuals survive spawning and go back to sea, the kype does not stay. After spawning, in the fish that live, the structure is dismantled, cells go in and resorb it, and the jaw returns toward its ordinary shape. The animal grew a weapon, used it for a season, and then reabsorbed it. Which raises the obvious question: where does the material come from in the first place? A kype is skeletal tissue. Skeletal tissue is mostly calcium and phosphorus. The fish is not eating. There is no calcium coming in from anywhere. No phosphorus, no protein, nothing. So the construction budget has to come out of the existing structure. And when researchers went looking, that's exactly what they found. Studies on migrating Atlantic salmon have measured the mineral content of the vertebrae before and during the spawning run and documented real losses. The spine gets demineralized while the fish swims on it. Say that slowly. The animal takes calcium out of its own backbone and uses it to build a hook on its face. That's the logic of this entire phase, and once you see it in the jaw, you see it everywhere. Take the hump. In pink salmon, it's extreme enough that the common name of the species in the trade is humpback. And a spawning male pink looks less like a fish than like something assembled by a committee that had never seen one. A great compressed ridge rising off the back, a hooked head, a body depth 2 or 3 times what it had at sea. Sockeye males do a subtler version of the same thing. The hump is built out of connective tissue and cartilage laid down over the vertebral spines, and it's grown in the river, in weeks, out of nothing. What it's for is still argued about. The strongest candidates are display, females, and rival males can both assess a male's size and condition instantly from that silhouette. And physical advantage in the shoving matches that dominate a spawning riffle, where being deeper-bodied and harder to displace is worth something in water a foot deep. It also, unhelpfully for the fish, makes them a more conspicuous target for a bear. Bears in some systems preferentially take the biggest, most developed males, which means the same structure that wins the competition can also end it. Take the skin. It thickens dramatically. The scales, which in an ocean salmon sit in clean, overlapping rows and come off in your hand, become embedded, grown over and absorbed into a toughened hide that will take an enormous amount of abrasion, which is a sensible thing to build because the animal is about to spend the last week of its life dragging itself repeatedly across coarse gravel in shallow, fast water. Take the color? That deep red is a staxanthin, hauled out of the muscle and deposited in the skin. It's a signal. To rivals, to mates, and it's an honest one, because you can only put pigment in your skin if you accumulated it in the ocean, which means you fed well, which means you were good at being a salmon. Now hold all of that together and look at what it amounts to. An adult vertebrate, in the last weeks of its life with no food coming in and a hard physical task in front of it, is running a full program of developmental biology. Growing novel skeletal structures, remodeling its skull, rebuilding its integument, relocating pigment between organ systems, dissolving parts of its skeleton to supply raw material to other parts. Most vertebrates at this stage of life are doing maintenance and nothing else. This one is under construction. And it's all being financed from a sealed account that's simultaneously paying for a 2-month upstream swim, which is exactly why the ornament turns out to be negotiable, and the swim doesn't. Remember the finding about sockeye populations calibrated to different rivers, the ones with long, high, difficult migrations arriving with more stored energy and sleeker bodies. That sleekness isn't only about drag. Those long-distance fish also develop less pronounced humps and less exaggerated jaws than the populations that spawn near the coast. The decoration gets cut back in the populations that can't afford it. Selection has apparently sat down with the budget and decided that a smaller hook on the face is survivable, and running out of fuel 100 miles short of the gravel is not. The sexes carry different versions of the same build, too. A male's investment goes into weaponry and display because his reproductive success depends on access. A female's goes almost entirely into eggs and into the physical work of digging, and her body stays closer to its ocean shape. She reddens, she thickens, but she doesn't build the architecture. She's carrying her investment inside her, so both animals are being disassembled. They're just being disassembled for different purposes. And so far, everything I've described is structural. Plumbing, fuel, materials, shape. It's all downstream of something else. And that something else is the part of this story that turns it from an impressive feat of endurance into something considerably darker. The salmon is not being worn out by the river. The salmon is being killed by its own endocrine system on schedule. And the process starts before it ever reaches the gravel. Every vertebrate you've ever met, including the one reading this sentence, runs on a stress hormone called cortisol. It's a good hormone. It does necessary work. When something demands more of you than your baseline supplies, a threat, a cold night, an injury, a hard physical effort, cortisol comes up. It mobilizes glucose. It shifts the body from storing energy to spending it. It quiets down systems that can wait. And immune function is one of the systems that can wait. The essential thing about cortisol in a healthy animal is that it turns itself off. The hormone circulates, reaches the brain, and the brain reads the level and dials back the signal that produced it. It's a thermostat. Rise, act, feedback, settle. That loop is what makes a stress response survivable. The response has an end. In a maturing Pacific salmon, the thermostat fails. The tissue that produces corticosteroids in a fish sits in the head kidney, and in salmon approaching spawning, it doesn't just work harder, it enlarges. The cells proliferate. The gland gets physically bigger and pours out hormone at rates that, in a fish at any other point in its life, would indicate something catastrophically wrong. Circulating cortisol in a spawning salmon reaches levels many times what a healthy animal would ever sustain, and it stays there, and it keeps climbing, and nothing shuts it off. Now go through what chronic, unopposed cortisol actually does to a body, because every item on that list should sound familiar by now. It drives protein breakdown. Cortisol tells muscle to release its amino acids into circulation so they can be converted to fuel. That's the mechanism behind the muscle catabolism I described earlier. The fish burning its own swimming apparatus. That's not simple starvation doing that. Starvation contributes, but there's a hormone standing over the process telling it to go faster. It suppresses immune function. Broadly and severely, it degrades the gut. Chronic corticosteroid excess thins the gastrointestinal lining and reduces its capacity, which lines up neatly with the digestive shutdown that begins in the estuary. It pulls mineral out of bone, which lines up with the demineralizing spine. It damages the cardiovascular system and the kidneys over time. Put those together and you have a syndrome, and in the middle of the last century, a physician researcher named O.H. Robertson noticed that the syndrome had a name in human medicine. When a person's body is exposed to sustained excess corticosteroid, usually from a tumor, sometimes from long-term treatment, they develop a recognizable cluster of problems: muscle wasting, thinning skin that damages easily, bone loss, immune suppression, cardiovascular strain. It's called Cushing's syndrome, and it is a serious and sometimes fatal condition. Robertson and his colleagues examined spawning Pacific salmon and described what they found in, essentially, those terms: the tissue changes, the wasting, the degenerative lesions in the heart and kidney and elsewhere. A fish reading like a clinical case study of steroid excess. In humans, that picture is pathology. In salmon, it arrives on schedule, in every individual, as part of normal life, which naturally raises the question of what's driving it. And this is where the research gets clever. Robertson removed the gonads from young sockeye before they matured, and then kept them. Their intact siblings did what sockeye do. They matured, they went through the cascade, and they died on time. The gonadectomized fish did not. They kept living. They kept growing. They went on for years, past the point at which the rest of their year class had died and decomposed, without the tissue degeneration, without the collapse. Removing the reproductive organs removed the death. Worth being precise about what that does and doesn't establish, because it's easy to overreach here. It shows that the gonads and the steroid environment they generate are required for the normal timetable. It doesn't prove cortisol acting alone is the executioner. The endocrine picture in a spawning salmon involves sex steroids, thyroid hormones, growth hormone, and several other things all moving at once. And researchers are still working out which parts of the damage belong to which signal. But the direction of the finding is unambiguous, and it points somewhere the fish's own body couldn't tell you. The death isn't coming from the river. That one deserves a moment, because everything in the popular version of this story, the leaping, the bears, the waterfalls, the 1,000 miles, sets up the expectation that these animals die of the journey. Exhaustion, effort, a body that gave everything it had and finally ran out. There's a set of natural experiments that takes that expectation apart. Consider a pink salmon spawning in the intertidal reach of a small coastal stream in southeast Alaska. Some pink and chum populations spawn so close to salt water that the tide reaches their reds. The migration is a matter of yards. There's no canyon, no falls, no 2-month fast, no elevation, nothing. Those fish enter fresh water, spawn within days, and die on exactly the same schedule as a Chinook that crossed 2,000 miles of Yukon. Consider kokanee, which are sockeye that never went to sea at all, landlocked, resident in a lake their whole lives, feeding right up until maturity. They mature, they color up, they run a few hundred yards into an inlet stream, and they die. Consider a hatchery. Broodstock salmon are held in clean water at controlled temperature, spawned by hand, protected from predators, and offered every advantage. They die anyway. They go through the whole cascade in a concrete raceway with nothing asked of them. The journey shapes how much fuel the animal needs and how much of it arrives. It determines who makes it and who doesn't, and in what condition. It's the reason the Yukon fish are fat and the reason the long migration populations wear smaller ornaments. It is a real and enormous cost. The date, though, gets set somewhere else entirely. It's installed in the animal in advance, tied to reproduction, and it fires whether the fish swam 2,000 miles or 200 feet, which turns the whole thing around. The migration becomes what the salmon does with the time it has after the kill order has already been issued. And that reframing has a consequence that took me by surprise the first time I followed it through. If the death is scheduled anyway, if it's coming regardless of distance, effort, or luck, then the animal has no reason whatsoever to hold anything in reserve. No reason to protect its muscle. No reason to maintain its gut. No reason to defend its skeleton. No reason to keep an immune system running past the date it's needed. Every gram of tissue in that body is now available to be spent, because there is no future self to spend it on. From the animal's side, that's a liquidation, and liquidations are efficient. Of everything the animal shuts down, the immune system is the one that changes how the fish looks, and it's the reason spawning salmon are hard to watch even for people who work with them. Immunity is expensive. Maintaining a standing defense costs energy continuously. You're running surveillance, replacing cells, keeping populations of specialized tissue alive against threats that may never arrive. In an animal with a future, that's the best money it spends. In an animal without one, it's overhead on a business that's closing. So it goes. The thymus is the organ where a fish's lymphocytes mature, and in salmon approaching spawning, it regresses. The tissue shrinks and loses its structure. Circulating white cell counts fall. The capacity to mount a response to anything new drops away. Sampling studies have found these changes underway in fish still in the lower river, days or weeks from where they're going. The defenses come down while the animal is still traveling. And fresh water, unlike the open ocean, is absolutely full of things waiting for exactly that. The most visible of them is a genus of water molds called Saprolegnia. It's everywhere. It's in essentially every temperate freshwater system on Earth, living on dead organic matter, doing the ordinary work of decomposition. It is not a serious threat to a healthy fish, because a healthy fish is covered in a layer of mucus, loaded with antimicrobial compounds, backed by intact skin, backed by an immune system that treats an attempted colonization as an emergency. Take those away, and the mold does what molds do. On a late-stage spawning salmon, you'll see it as pale, grayish-white patches with a slightly furred texture, usually starting where the skin has been abraded, along the flanks, at the base of the fins, around the jaw, sometimes across the head. The patches spread, the fins fray back. The eyes go cloudy. Lesions open where the fish has scraped against rock and simply never close, because wound healing is another expensive process that has been defunded. And this is the part footage rarely conveys, the part that makes it hard to look at. The fish is alive through all of it. It's swimming. It's holding position in the current. Males are still fighting. Females are still digging. A salmon can be visibly rotting on one flank and be actively defending a nest with the other, and it will keep doing that for days. This is decomposition beginning in a living animal that hasn't finished its work yet. And the reason it's possible is that from the body's point of view, decomposition is no longer a problem. There's nothing to protect. There's no next season to be healthy for. Underneath the visible damage, the internal picture is similar. The kidneys degenerate. The liver goes through severe changes as it works overtime on egg protein and then on processing the wreckage of the fish's own tissue. And the heart is its own peculiar chapter. Pacific salmon are known among fish physiologists for something you'd expect to read about in a cardiology journal. Their coronary arteries develop lesions, thickened, damaged arterial walls, of a kind that in a human would be called arteriosclerosis. It shows up in these fish routinely, and it drew serious research attention decades ago precisely because it looked so much like a disease we'd assumed belonged to sedentary humans with bad diets. Here it was, in a wild, athletic, fasting fish that had never eaten a processed meal in its life. That's happening in an organ that is simultaneously being asked for the hardest sustained output of its existence, in water that in a bad year is too warm for it, in an animal whose aerobic capacity is already narrowing. There's also a category of problem that comes along for the ride from the ocean. Salmon carry parasites and pathogens picked up at sea, and in a healthy fish with a working immune system, many of those infections stay quiet, present, contained, doing little. As immunity falls away during the migration, some of them stop being quiet. On the Yukon in particular, Researchers have tracked a parasitic infection in Chinook that appears to worsen as the fish move upriver and has been associated with fish failing to complete the migration. The organism didn't get more aggressive. The host stopped arguing with it. So assemble the fish that finally reaches its home tributary. Its fat is nearly gone. A significant fraction of its muscle has been broken down and burned. Its stomach and intestine are atrophied and empty. Its skeleton has given up mineral. Its jaw has been rebuilt into a shape it wasn't born with. Its skin is thickened, colored, abraded, and in places infected. Its immune system is effectively offline. Its kidneys and liver are damaged. Its heart is compromised. Its endocrine system is running a hormone at levels that would be diagnosed as a fatal condition in a human being. And it is not finished. It hasn't done the thing yet. All of that was transport. The actual work, finding the site, competing for it, excavating it, spawning, and defending the nest afterward, is still ahead, and it's the most physically demanding sequence in the entire life cycle. It's being attempted by an animal in that condition. I think this is the real answer, and it isn't quite the one people expect. The miles are simply where you can watch the cost being paid. What it actually costs is this. The animal has been converted, over a period of weeks, from a fish into a delivery mechanism, and the conversion is chemical, structural, and total. There's no version of the salmon left at the end that could go back to the ocean and try again. The parts that would have gone back have been spent. That leaves the question biologists actually argue about, and it's a better question than it first sounds. Why would evolution ever build an animal that way? Because on its face, this looks like terrible design. An animal that reproduces once and dies has exactly one chance. Bad year, warm water, a slide in the canyon, a poorly chosen gravel bar, a flood in October that scours the nest, and that individual's entire genetic contribution is gone. An animal that reproduces 3 or 4 times across several years spreads that risk. That's the whole logic of not putting everything in one place. And plenty of fish do it the other way. Most fish, actually. So the salmon's arrangement demands an explanation. The technical word for reproducing once and dying is semelparity. Reproducing repeatedly across a lifetime is iteroparity. Almost every vertebrate you can name is in the second category, and the question of why anything would be in the first one is old. And for a while, it looked unanswerable. An ecologist named Lamont Cole laid the problem out in the 1950s, and the version of it that got his name attached goes roughly like this. Imagine an organism that breeds once and dies, and another that breeds every year for many years. Run the arithmetic on their population growth, and you find something absurd. The one-shot organism can match the multi-year organism just by producing a single additional offspring, one extra. That's the entire advantage of a long reproductive life on paper. If that's true, living to breed again is barely worth anything, and the world should be full of animals that reproduce once. It obviously isn't. So either the math was wrong or something was missing from it. What was missing was death. The arithmetic assumed everybody survives to try again. In reality, an animal that finishes breeding and sets out to do it a second time has to survive the interval. And the interval can be brutal. Once you put realistic survival rates into the equations, which is what a couple of theorists did in the 1970s, the picture flips into something sensible. When adults have a decent chance of living to breed again, spreading the investment across several attempts wins easily. When that chance is poor, holding anything back is a losing move. So the question about salmon becomes concrete and answerable. What would it actually take for a Pacific salmon to spawn twice? Walk it through. Spawn out in a headwater tributary in October, in a body that has already burned most of its fat and a large share of its muscle. Then, turnaround. Descend hundreds of miles of river, in winter, with essentially no fuel left, through the same rapids and canyons. Easier going downstream, but you're doing it on empty. Reach the estuary, cross the salinity barrier again, in the other direction, which means rebuilding the gills for a third time in 1 year on no energy. Rebuild the digestive tract you dismantled, because you cannot eat until you do. Then start feeding in the ocean in winter as a weakened, damaged, conspicuous animal in water full of things that eat weakened, damaged, conspicuous animals. Then feed for a year or two until you're back in condition. Then do the entire migration over again. The chance of that succeeding for a fish from a long interior river isn't small. It's effectively zero. And once it's effectively zero, the calculation for the individual animal changes completely. Every calorie kept in reserve for a future that will not arrive is a calorie that didn't go into eggs. Every gram of muscle protected instead of catabolized is a gram that didn't become yolk. An immune system maintained past October is a subsidy paid to nobody. Under those conditions, the optimal strategy is to convert everything, the entire body, down to the mineral in the bones, into this year's offspring, and let the empty container fall over. That's what semel parity is. It's what maximal investment looks like when there's no second round to save for. Now, a theory is only worth something if it predicts things, so here's the test. If this is right, then salmon that face an easy return trip should be able to afford to survive. Semel parity should relax where the journey relaxes. That's exactly what the group shows. Start with Atlantic salmon, which people often assume is basically the same animal as a Pacific salmon, and isn't even in the same genus. Atlantic salmon are iteroporous. A fraction of them survive spawning. They're called kelts. Drop back down the river, return to the sea, feed, recover condition, and come back to spawn again. In most rivers, the fraction is modest, often a few percent, and it skews heavily female, which makes sense given that males spend themselves on combat and display, while females spend on eggs and digging. In some systems, it runs considerably higher, and it tends to be highest in rivers where the migration is short, and the passage back to salt water is straightforward. Then there's steelhead, and steelhead are the clincher, because steelhead are not Atlantic salmon. They're in Oncorhynchus, the same genus as sockeye and chinook and coho. They're sea-run rainbow trout, same lineage, same ocean, same rivers, same predators. Steelhead can spawn more than once, and within steelhead, the pattern holds beautifully. Fish from short coastal rivers, a few dozen miles of easy water between the spawning gravel and the sea, repeat spawn at meaningfully higher rates. Fish from the long interior runs, the ones that climb hundreds of miles and thousands of feet through the Columbia and the Snake, almost never make it back a second time. Same species, different rivers, different answer to the same equation. That's about as clean a natural experiment as field biology hands you. The strategy tracks the cost of the trip river by river and adjusts. There's one more piece to this. It's still argued about, and it's where that spruce tree from earlier comes back in. Some biologists have proposed that the carcass isn't just a leftover. The standard picture treats a dead salmon as a used-up container. The reproduction happened, the fish had no further use, the body drops, reasonable. But there's a competing suggestion that the delivery of the body itself is part of what the parent contributes, that the dead adults are feeding a system their own offspring will hatch into, and that this feedback is strong enough to have been selected for. It's a contested idea. Proving that a trait was selected for its downstream ecological effect is difficult, and there are researchers who think the nutrient contribution is real and important without being the reason semel parity evolved. The honest summary is that the ecological consequence is thoroughly documented, and the evolutionary causation is not settled. But the consequence, on its own, without any claim about why, is the largest thing in this entire story. And I'd argue it's the reason salmon matter to places that have never seen salt water. Because that stream full of dying fish in October is a delivery in progress. It's an unloading dock at the end of a supply line 2,000 miles long. Before any of that, though, the fish still has to get where it's going, and the last stretch of the route is the strangest scale change in the whole journey. Think about the sequence in terms of the water alone. A gulf that runs to the horizon in every direction and drops thousands of feet beneath. Then a coastline, then a river mouth miles across, then a main stem narrowing, then a tributary off that tributary, and finally, at the end of it, a creek, clear, cold, shallow enough that the fish's dorsal fin cuts the surface, narrow enough in places that you could put a foot on either bank. An animal that spent 3 years in the largest habitat on the planet finishes its life in a channel the width of a hallway. And it is not random which hallway. The gravel matters enormously, and the specifications are surprisingly tight. The stones have to be the right size. Big enough that the current won't wash the nest out at the first high water, small enough that a fish can actually move them with her tail. The water has to be moving with some pace, because the whole design depends on flow. And underneath the surface, in the spaces between the stones, water has to be percolating through. That last one is the entire point of the exercise, and it's worth understanding because it explains everything about where salmon choose to die. A salmon egg buried under a foot of gravel has no way to breathe on its own. It has no gills, no circulation, no movement. It sits in a dark pocket among the stones and takes oxygen out of whatever water flows past it. And it does that for months. Through fall, through winter, under ice in some systems, until spring. If the water stops moving through the gravel, the embryo suffocates. If fine sediment fills the spaces between the stones and chokes the flow, the embryo suffocates. If the gravel dries out because the creek drops, the embryo dies. So what the female is hunting for is a place where water will keep moving through the ground for the next several months without failing. In a lot of systems, the best of those places are where groundwater is coming up through the stream bed, upwelling. Because upwelled water is oxygenated, it's clean, and it holds a steady temperature that keeps the eggs from freezing in January and cooking in a warm spell. Salmon find those spots with real precision. Reds cluster on them. Year after year, in the same reaches of the same creeks, across generations of fish that never met each other. Now when the run arrives, the density in these places is difficult to convey. In a strong year on a small system, the bottom of the creek moves. Bodies overlap bodies, red and dark and torn. Fins above the waterline. The constant low sound of water breaking around a few hundred animals that are all trying to occupy the same 40 yards of gravel. The smell is intense and unmistakable. The fish that have already died are lying in the shallows and on the bars, and the ones still alive are in the water beside them. That's the setting for the last competition of the animal's life. For males, it's mostly a size contest decided fast. Big males take up position beside the most attractive females and drive off anything smaller. The kype, the hooked jaw that got built out of the fish's own skeleton, now does the job it was assembled for. It's used to grip, to grapple, to slash at a rival's flank and tail. Fights are short and frequent. The wounds don't heal. By the end of a week on the gravel, a dominant male's tail can be shredded and his flanks laid open, and he keeps fighting because there's nothing to save himself for. And then there are the jacks. A jack is a male that came back early, a year or two ahead of his cohort, at a fraction of the size. In some Chinook and Coho populations, they're common. They're small enough that the term for them in some places is a joke. And they are absolutely not a joke, because they've solved the problem from the other direction. A jack can't win a fight. He doesn't try. He tucks into the boulders and the undercut banks near a spawning pair and waits, sometimes for hours, while a large male burns himself out defending the position. And at the precise moment, the female releases her eggs. The jack shoots in from cover, releases his own milt into the nest, and is gone before the big male can turn. That's a real reproductive strategy, and it persists because it works often enough. It's also self-limiting in an elegant way. The more jacks there are in a population, the harder it is for any individual jack to get away with it, and the more valuable it becomes to be big. The two strategies hold each other in balance, and neither ever wins. There's an unglamorous truth in that, and I like it. The whole magnificent apparatus, the 2,000-mile navigation, the rebuilt skull, the scarlet body, the fighting, can be undercut by a fish a third the size that hid behind a rock and moved at the right second. For the female, all of that fighting is background noise. Her decision is the sight, and she makes it alone. Males can fight over her all week. They have no say in where the nest goes. She works along the reach, and she tests. She turns partly on her side and gives the gravel a probing flex of her tail, a movement people who watch salmon call cutting, and reads what happens, how the stones shift, whether her tail moves them at all, what the flow does when the surface layer is disturbed. She'll test several places and reject them. It's the most consequential choice any salmon makes, and she's making it in the last days of her life, running on almost nothing, with her body coming apart. When she settles, she starts to dig. Digging for a salmon has nothing to do with pushing. She has no limbs. She can't scoop, can't lift, can't shovel. What she has is a tail and an understanding of water, and what she does with them is closer to engineering than to labor. She turns onto her side, close to the bottom, and flexes her whole body in a single hard sweep. The tail beats upward against the stream bed, and the motion creates a pulse of low pressure that lifts the stones off the bottom, and the current, which is already moving downstream, takes them away. She's briefly unsticking the gravel and letting the river carry it off. Then she does it again, and again, and again. It goes on for hours, and it goes on for days. The pit deepens. Fine sediment gets flushed out of the spaces between the stones in the process, which is a second benefit. The act of digging cleans the gravel and improves the very water flow the eggs will depend on. In a big Chinook, the finished structure can be several feet long and a foot or more deep, and represents a startling quantity of moved stream bed, all of it performed by an animal with no fuel left, no functioning gut, a demineralized skeleton, an immune system that quit weeks ago, and open wounds on its flanks. There's a version of endurance that's about pushing through pain, and this isn't quite that. Pain implies a body that's protesting, and this body has stopped protesting. It's just executing. When the pit is right, the actual spawning is over in seconds. The female drops into the depression and settles against the bottom. A male moves alongside her, pressed close. Both of them open their mouths wide, and their bodies go rigid and vibrate. And in that moment, she releases a stream of eggs into the pocket at the bottom of the pit, and he releases milt over them. Depending on the species and her size, she's putting out something in the range of a few thousand eggs across the whole red. A pink salmon toward the lower end, a large Chinook considerably more. The fertilization window is astonishingly short. Salmon sperm, once it hits fresh water, is only motile for a matter of seconds. Not minutes. Seconds. Everything about the timing of that shared moment in the gravel exists because the chemistry gives them almost no margin. And each egg has exactly one door. There's a single microscopic pore in the egg membrane, the micropyle, and it's the only way in. One sperm gets through it. Then the egg takes on water, hardens, swells slightly, and the pore closes. From that point, the egg is a sealed vessel, and it will sit in the dark among the stones through the whole winter, breathing through its shell on the water the mother chose the site for. Then she does something that I think is the most quietly brilliant piece of engineering in the entire sequence. She moves a short distance upstream of the pocket she just filled and starts digging again. The gravel she lifts out of the new pit gets carried downstream by the current, which is to say directly onto the eggs she just laid. The excavation of nest 2 is the burial of nest 1. She doesn't have to go back and cover anything. The geometry of the river does it for her, as long as she works upstream, and she always works upstream. Then she spawns in the new pocket. Then she moves up again and digs a third. A single female will typically build several egg pockets over a period of days, spreading her clutch across the structure, which is its own small insurance policy. If a flood scours one part of the red, or a bear stands in it, or another female digs into it, the whole investment isn't in one hole, and she does all of this while she's dying, in stages you can watch, because the red needs defending. Salmon runs are compressed into a short window and the good gravel is limited, so females arriving later face a choice between poor sites and sites already occupied. Some of them dig into existing reds. The technical term is superimposition, and in a dense year it can destroy an enormous number of eggs. A later female excavating a pocket can lift the earlier female's eggs right out of the gravel and send them down the current, where they're eaten within seconds by whatever's waiting downstream. Trout, sculpins, juvenile salmon, birds. Nothing goes to waste in a spawning creek, which is a phrase that's about to become the whole point. So the female stays on her nest and drives off other females. She's not eating. She's not resting. She's holding a position in current against animals in the same condition she's in. And she keeps doing it until she physically can't. Depending on the species and the water, that can be a few days or it can be closer to 2 weeks. The males generally go first. A male's job on the gravel is finished sooner. He's spent more of himself on combat. And in most systems, males die earlier and are the first bodies to accumulate along the bars. The females hold on longer, and then they stop too. It doesn't happen dramatically. She loses the ability to hold station, drifts back a few feet, recovers, drifts again. Eventually, she's in an eddy, or pinned sideways against a root wad, or in the shallows on her side with her gill cover still working. And at some point, they stop working. By late November, in most of these systems, it's finished. The bodies are on the bars and in the eddies. The creek is quiet and running clear and cold, and there is nothing visible in it that looks like a salmon. Everything that matters is now underground. A salmon egg is a sphere a little smaller than a pea, orange, translucent, with a dark spot in it once the eyes form. It's sitting in a pocket among the stones, under 6 inches or a foot of gravel, in the dark, in water flowing through the spaces between the rocks at a rate you'd need instruments to detect. And it has no schedule of its own. This is one of my favorite details in the whole life cycle, because it's so unlike how we think about development. The embryo inside that egg doesn't run on days. It runs on temperature. Development in a salmon egg proceeds at a rate set by how warm the water is, and biologists track it by adding up the daily temperature. Accumulate enough thermal units, and the egg hatches, regardless of what the calendar says, which means the river is the clock. In a cold headwater system, an egg laid in October might not hatch until March. In a warmer, spring-fed creek, the same species might hatch by January. And the payoff of running on temperature instead of on time is that emergence lands in the right season automatically. A cold year runs the clock slow, and the fry come out late, into a spring that also arrived late. A warm year runs it fast, into an early spring. The embryo has no way of knowing what conditions are like up in the daylight, and it doesn't have to. The water tells it. That's a tidy solution. And it's also the reason warming rivers are such a serious problem for these animals. Change the temperature and you don't just stress the fish, you move the hatch date, and you can slide it out of alignment with the food that's supposed to be there when it happens. Now that egg has to survive the winter. And winter in a mountain stream is not a gentle place. The main threat is scour. A heavy rain or a rapid snowmelt sends the creek up, and a flood big enough to mobilize the stream bed will pick up the gravel, including the gravel the red is built out of, and roll it downstream, and the eggs go with it. That's why the female's choice of site mattered so much, and why the depth she dug to mattered. Eggs buried deeper in coarser gravel in a stable reach survive floods that destroy shallower nests 100 feet away. The second threat is silt. Fine sediment washing in from a bare slope or a road cut or a logged hillside settles into the spaces between the stones and seals them. The flow through the gravel drops, the oxygen supply to the eggs drops, and they suffocate. This is the single most direct way human land use kills salmon that nobody ever sees happening, because it happens underground to animals that haven't hatched. The eggs that survive hatch into something that surprises people the first time they see it. A newly hatched salmon is called an alevin, and it comes out of the egg with the yolk sac still attached to its belly. A big translucent orange sphere, in some cases nearly as large as the fish itself. It's a fish with its lunch bolted to its underside, and it does not go anywhere. It stays down in the gravel, in the dark, in the interstitial spaces, actively avoiding light, drawing on the yolk and growing. That period lasts weeks. In cold systems, it can run to a couple of months. The whole time, the animal is invisible, buried, breathing water that's percolating through stone. When the yolk is used up, the fish has to come out, and it does, wriggling up through the gravel to the surface in a process called swim up. It fills its swim bladder, and for the first time in its existence, it's in open water, in daylight, with nothing between it and the world. It's now a fry. It's about an inch long, and it has to eat immediately. What happens next depends entirely on species, and the divergence is dramatic. Pink and chum fry head for salt water almost right away. They emerge, they drop downstream, and within days to weeks, they're in the estuary. They spend essentially no time rearing in fresh water at all, which produces a quiet asymmetry worth noticing. Those two species deliver a full load of marine nutrients into a stream, and their offspring barely stay long enough to benefit from it. Whatever the carcasses are doing in a pink salmon creek, they're mostly doing it for somebody else. Sockeye do the opposite. Sockeye fry make their way to a lake. The species is tied to lake systems in a way the others aren't, and they rear there for 1 to 3 years, feeding on plankton, growing, before they ever consider the ocean. Coho hold in streams and side channels and beaver ponds for a year or two, which is why coho are so sensitive to the loss of small off-channel habitat. Chinook do both, depending on the population. Some go to sea in their first months, some stay a full year. For the ones that stay, that early stream life is where the carcass subsidy actually pays. They're feeding in fertilized water, growing on insects that grew on the previous generation, and putting on the size that will determine their odds later. And then, at some point, the light changes. Lengthening days in spring trigger the transformation I described near the start: smoltification. The vertical bars fade, the flanks turn silver, the gills begin rebuilding for salt water, and the whole behavior of the animal flips from holding a territory to moving downstream with the current in a school. That transformation is also, as far as anyone can tell, the imprinting window. This is the moment the fish learns the smell of home. Somewhere in that hormonal reorganization, the olfactory memory gets laid down. The specific chemical profile of this water, this creek, these soils, this particular set of compounds, and it's fixed there for the rest of the animal's life to be retrieved years later out in the salt. which closes the circle on the navigation story from earlier, and closes it somewhere most people wouldn't think to look. The information that makes the return possible gets captured on the way out by a fish the length of your finger during the 2 or 3 weeks when its body happens to be in the right hormonal state to record it. Everything the adult does years later, the magnetic map, the coastline, the plume, the fork in the tributary, is retrieval of a file written during that window. There's a thought I keep having about this that I'll flag clearly as speculation, because I've seen no evidence establishing it, and I don't want to dress it up as more than a wondering. The water that Fry is imprinting on has been chemically altered by the carcasses of the generation before it. The nitrogen levels, the dissolved organics, the whole biological load of that stream in spring is downstream of what happened in the gravel the previous autumn. Whether any of that contributes to the odor signature the fish records, I have no idea. And I'm not aware of anyone who does. It just sits there as a nice thought, and I'd leave it as that. Then the smolt goes. Down the tributary, down the river, through the reaches its parents fought upstream through past the canyon into the estuary. And there it does the transformation in reverse of what its mother did coming in. The gill switch from absorbing salt to expelling it. The drinking begins. The whole machinery inverts over days in brackish water. And then it's gone into the largest habitat on Earth to be anonymous for 3 years. Out of everything that was in that gravel, this is how many make it all the way around. Across a whole population, over the long run, the average pair of spawning salmon is replaced by about 2 returning adults. That's what a stable population means. 2 fish in, 2 fish out of thousands of eggs. Survival from egg to spawning adult, taken across the entire life cycle, runs to a fraction of 1%. Almost every egg in that gravel is going to fail. Most fail as embryos, in the winter from silt or scour or freezing. Most of the ones that emerge get eaten in their first weeks. Most of the survivors of that get eaten in the estuary. Most of the survivors of that die at sea. 2 make it back. That's the arithmetic those animals just spent their entire bodies on. And here's the part that reorients the whole thing. The arithmetic works. Populations that have been running this system for millions of years are still here, in numbers that in a good year can turn a river red from bank to bank. A strategy that survives at that rate for that long is running entirely on the size of its numerator. And all the failures, every egg that doesn't make it, every fry eaten by a trout, every adult that dies in the shallows, none of that material leaves the system. That's what the last part of this is about. Go back to the arithmetic of that body for a moment and think about what it's actually made of. Everything in a spawning salmon came out of the North Pacific. The protein in its muscle was assembled from marine amino acids. The fat was made from marine lipids. The nitrogen in every cell, the phosphorus in its bones, the trace metals, the carbon. All of it was taken up in salt water, thousands of miles away, over several years of feeding. The fish is a container of ocean, and it has just carried that container, under its own power, up a river, into a mountain valley, hundreds of miles from the coast, to a place where a lot of it will now be released. Rivers do not work that way. Rivers move material downhill. It's the entire premise of a watershed. Rain falls, water collects, and everything dissolved or suspended in it heads toward the sea. Nitrogen, phosphorus, carbon, silt, leaf litter, the mineral content of the mountains themselves. A river is a one-way conveyor, and the ocean is at the bottom of it. Salmon run it backwards. They are one of the few mechanisms on Earth that move a significant quantity of marine nutrients uphill and inland against the entire gradient, on a schedule, in bulk, every single year. And the reason they can do it is precisely the thing this whole story has been about. They die at the top. An Iteroporous fish would carry that cargo up and then take it back down again. It has to. It's still using it. Semmelparity is what turns a round trip into a one-way freight delivery. So what happens to a few 100,000 dead fish in a small watershed? Start in the water. The carcasses accumulate in the shallows, in eddies, against log jams, on the gravel bars, in the slack water at the inside of every bend. Some sink and stay in the pools. In a big run, the sheer physical mass is hard to picture. A small creek can receive tons of fish in a season, concentrated into a few weeks, in a channel that for the rest of the year is one of the most nutrient-poor environments in the region. That poverty is the key to why this matters so much. Cold, clear, fast headwater streams running over bedrock and gravel in a coniferous forest are beautiful and biologically thin. There's not much nitrogen. There's not much phosphorus. The whole system is running lean, and productivity is capped by that. Then, once a year, the ocean shows up. Decomposition starts almost immediately. Bacteria and fungi work the carcasses, and the nutrients begin dissolving into the water column and settling into the stream bed. Dissolved nitrogen and phosphorus climb measurably in salmon streams during and after a run. The first thing that responds is the film of algae and diatoms growing on the rocks. Periphyton, the green-brown slime that makes streambed stones slippery. It's the base of the food web in these systems, and it's usually nutrient-limited. Give it a pulse of nitrogen and phosphorus and it grows. Then the invertebrates respond. Mayfly larvae, stoneflies, caddisflies, midges. Some graze the enriched algae. Others feed directly on the carcasses. You can lift a dead salmon out of a creek and find the underside crawling. Insect abundance in salmon streams rises through and after a run. And then the fish respond, and this is where it gets pointed. The juvenile salmon that hatch out of that gravel the following spring are feeding in a stream that was fertilized by the previous generation's corpses. They eat the insects that grew on the enrichment. In many systems, they also directly eat drifting fragments of carcass tissue, and they eat loose eggs washed out of redds. One of the highest quality foods available anywhere in fresh water. Studies comparing streams with and without carcass input have found juvenile salmonids growing faster and reaching larger sizes where the carcasses are. Size matters enormously for a juvenile salmon. A bigger fry survives winter better. A bigger smolt survives the ocean better. There's a well-documented relationship between the size a young salmon reaches before it goes to sea and its odds of ever coming back. So the loop closes. The parents' bodies feed the stream that grows the food, that grows the offspring, that determine how many return in 3 or 4 years to do it again. Whether that loop is the reason the animals evolved to die is the open question I flagged earlier. And I'll leave it open, because it deserves to stay open. But the loop itself is real, and it's been measured repeatedly. And it doesn't stop at the water's edge, not remotely. Because a spawning run is the single largest concentration of accessible, high-fat, high-protein food that appears anywhere in a northern forest. And it appears right before winter. Everything in that forest knows it. The list of species documented feeding on salmon or salmon-derived material in the Pacific Northwest runs well over 100 vertebrates. Surveys compiling this have counted somewhere north of 130 species of mammals, birds, reptiles, and amphibians with a documented link to salmon. Plenty of those are casual visitors. Plenty of them aren't, and have annual cycles organized around the run. Bald eagles concentrate on spawning rivers in numbers that are hard to believe if you haven't seen it. Hundreds of birds along a few miles of river in southeast Alaska and British Columbia, many of them having traveled specifically for it. Gulls work the shallows, ravens and crows. Mergansers and dippers take eggs and fry. Mink and otter, wolves. And in some coastal areas, wolves take a substantial share of their autumn diet from salmon, which is a thing most people picturing a wolf never picture at all. And bears. Bears are the part of this that turns a stream story into a forest story, because bears do something none of the others do, at anything like the same scale. Bears carry the fish away from the water. Picture a brown bear standing in a shallow riffle in early October, in a creek somewhere on the coast of British Columbia or southeast Alaska, with more fish in front of it than it could eat in a month. The bear is doing two things at once. One is obvious: it's eating, and it needs to. A coastal brown bear has a matter of weeks to put on the fat that will carry it through denning, and salmon are the densest food it will ever encounter. The other thing it's doing is less obvious and much more consequential for the forest standing behind it. It's moving cargo. Start with the catching. A single bear on a productive system can take an enormous number of fish across a season. Estimates from long-term field studies run into the hundreds per animal, and on the best streams higher than that. Multiply by the number of bears working a watershed, and the total tonnage removed from the water becomes substantial. Now, when fish are scarce, a bear eats a fish, all of it. When fish are abundant, the behavior changes completely, and it changes for a reason that's straightforward economics. If there are more salmon in the creek than a bear can process, then the limiting factor stops being how many fish it can catch and becomes how much energy it can extract per unit of time. Under those conditions, the rational move is to eat only the best parts and go get another fish. So that's what they do. Field researchers who have watched this closely describe bears in high abundance conditions consistently taking the brain, the eggs from females, and the fatty belly tissue and skin and abandoning the rest. It looks wasteful. It's the opposite of wasteful from the bear's side. It's the highest return strategy available, and bears switch into it and out of it depending on how many fish are running. The consequence is that in a strong year, a large fraction of the biomass a bear removes from that creek is left uneaten. And here's the part that matters for the trees. It's not left in the creek. Bears carry fish out of the water and into cover before eating. There's a straightforward reason. A bear standing in an open riffle with a salmon is advertising to every other bear in the drainage, and larger animals will simply take it. So they haul their catch up the bank and into the timber, and they eat it in the shade, and they leave what's left there. Long-term work on this, including a research program on Haida Gwaii that ran for years documenting bear behavior on salmon streams, has tracked how far the fish actually travel. The distances are mostly modest in absolute terms, typically some tens of yards from the water's edge, with a tail extending considerably further. But the volume is not modest at all. Across a season, along a single mile of productive salmon stream, the mass of fish that bears drag into the surrounding forest can run to thousands of pounds. That's the delivery. A conveyor of dead marine animals moving from the water into the root zone of a forest, powered by bears, running annually for as far back as anyone can measure. And once a carcass is lying under the trees, a second set of machinery takes over. Blowflies find it within hours. They lay eggs, the eggs hatch, and the maggots consume the carcass with remarkable speed. A salmon left on the forest floor can be reduced to skin and bone in a matter of days when the fly population is up. It's the same process you'd see on any carcass anywhere, with one detail specific to this system that's worth noticing. The maggots don't stay. They mature, they drop off into the leaf litter and the soil, they pupate, and they emerge as adult flies that disperse across the landscape. Along the way, a large number of them are eaten by birds, by shrews, by beetles, by everything that works a forest floor. Which means the nitrogen doesn't simply sit in one spot under one tree. It gets picked up and redistributed by animals with wings. And there's a third route which is the least dignified and possibly the most effective. A bear that eats 40 or 50 pounds of salmon in a day processes it and deposits the remainder across its range. Bear range is large. A brown bear moves miles in a day, and the nitrogen and phosphorus it took out of that creek gets scattered through the forest in a pattern determined by where the bear went and what else it was doing. So the delivery runs in stages, each one handing off to the next. Fish into bear, bear into forest, carcass into fly, fly into bird, waste into soil. Each stage moves the material further from the water and spreads it wider. That's the mechanism. Now comes the hard part, and it's the part that separates a nice story from actual science. How would you ever prove any of it? Because you can watch a bear carry a salmon into the woods all day long, and you still haven't demonstrated that a tree used the nitrogen. Forests have nitrogen from other sources. Rain deposits it. Bacteria in the soil fix it out of the atmosphere. Alder trees, which line a lot of these same streams, host nitrogen-fixing bacteria in their roots and pump substantial amounts of nitrogen into the soil all by themselves. Decomposing needles in wood recycle it endlessly. If you core a spruce and find nitrogen in the wood, that finding is worth nothing on its own. Of course, there's nitrogen in the wood. It's a tree. You need something that carries a label. You need a way to look at a nitrogen atom sitting in a plant 300 yards from a creek and say where that atom has been. As it happens, the ocean marks its own. Nitrogen comes in two stable forms. The common one has an atomic weight of 14 and makes up the overwhelming majority of the nitrogen on this planet, better than 99 parts in 100. The rare one weighs 15, and it's a fraction of 1% of the total. Chemically, they're interchangeable. A cell can't tell them apart in any meaningful sense and will use either. But there's a subtle physical difference, essas kan de desações, and biology exploits it without meaning to. The heavier isotope moves a little more sluggishly through chemical reactions. Enzymes work fractionally faster on the light one. The practical result shows up in excretion. When an animal metabolizes protein and dumps the nitrogen waste, it preferentially sheds the lighter isotope and hangs on to slightly more of the heavier one. So the animal's own tissue ends up marginally enriched in nitrogen-15 compared to the food it ate. Do that once, and the difference is tiny. On the order of a few parts per 1,000. Do it at every step of a food chain, and it stacks, which turns the ratio into a record of position. Measure the balance of those two isotopes in an organism's tissue, and you can read, approximately, how many steps up a food web it's sitting. Now compare two food chains. A forest's is short, and it starts from air. Atmospheric nitrogen is the baseline, and a lot of the nitrogen entering a temperate forest ecosystem comes from bacteria, pulling it directly out of the atmosphere and fixing it into a usable form. Plants take that up. The signature stays low. The open ocean's food chain is long. Microscopic algae, then the zooplankton that eat them, then the small fish and squid that eat the zooplankton, then the salmon that eats those. 4 steps, minimum, each one adding its increment. A salmon that spent 3 years in the Gulf of Alaska carries a nitrogen signature that is unmistakably, measurably heavy, which means the fish is labeled, not metaphorically. Every ounce of tissue in that animal is stamped with a chemical marker that says marine food web, and the stamp doesn't wash off when it decomposes. It passes into the soil and into whatever takes the nitrogen up. So the question becomes empirical. Go into a coastal forest, take foliage from the trees along a salmon stream, run the isotope ratio, and see whether the trees are carrying the ocean's mark. The design that makes this convincing is elegant, and it uses the geography of the rivers themselves. Most of these coastal watersheds have waterfalls in them, real ones, tall enough that no salmon has ever gotten above them. Below the falls, salmon spawn every year and have for thousands of years. Above the falls, the same stream runs through the same bedrock under the same rainfall, growing the same species of tree, and no salmon has ever been there. That's a controlled experiment nobody had to build. Everything is held constant except the fish. Researchers working in southeast Alaska did exactly this comparison on Sitka spruce along salmon reaches and reference reaches. The trees on the salmon reaches showed the marine nitrogen signature in their foliage, and the reference trees didn't, or showed far less of it. When the numbers were worked through, the estimate came out that roughly a quarter of the nitrogen in the foliage of those riparian spruce had come from salmon. A quarter. In a tree. On a mountainside. From fish. And the trees weren't only carrying the signal. They were growing on it. The spruce along the salmon reaches were putting on wood at rates several times higher than comparable trees where salmon couldn't reach over long periods, in a region where nitrogen is the thing that limits growth more than anything else. Now, honest caveats, because this is the kind of finding that gets oversold, and the underlying science is more careful than the headlines about it. The isotope method has complications. Certain soil processes, bacteria converting nitrogen compounds and releasing gas, can leave the leftover pool in the soil enriched in the heavy isotope without any fish involved at all. So a raised signature is not automatically proof of salmon. Alder, which grows thickly along many of these same streams, fixes nitrogen from the air and pushes the signature in the other direction, which can mask a real salmon contribution. Good studies handle this by measuring multiple elements, by using the above and below barrier design, by controlling for vegetation, and by looking at the whole pattern rather than one number. When all of that is done properly, the effect survives. It's been found repeatedly, in different watersheds, by different groups, using different approaches. Plant communities themselves shift near salmon streams. The species that thrive on rich soil become more common close to the water where the carcasses end up. Songbirds nesting in those riparian strips carry the marine signature in their tissue. The insects carry it. The soil carries it. An entire terrestrial community, hundreds of feet from any water and hundreds of miles from any coast, is partially constructed out of the North Pacific. So, back to the tree. Trees lay down a ring every year, and each ring is a sample of the material available to that tree during that growing season. So, in principle, a tree core is a chronological archive, a stack of annual samples going back as far as the tree is old. Researchers have gone after that archive. Cores taken from old spruce along salmon rivers have been sectioned ring by ring and run for nitrogen isotopes. And in several studies, the signature varies from ring to ring in a pattern that lines up with what's known about salmon abundance in that system across those years. Strong runs, heavier signature; weak runs, lighter. That work comes with its own asterisk, and it's a real one. Nitrogen isn't perfectly locked into a ring once the ring forms. Trees move nutrients around internally, which can blur a year-to-year signal. And how much blurring occurs is something researchers are still working out. So the fine-grained reading of individual years is treated with appropriate caution. But the coarse finding that the wood of these trees contains nitrogen of marine origin, and that the amount of it tracks the presence of salmon, has held up, which means the thing I put down at the very beginning is real. And it's stranger than it sounded then. There are trees standing in valleys in Alaska and British Columbia, whose growth rings function as a record of how many fish came up the creek. Wood keeps a record of rainfall and temperature and fire. These rings also keep a record of a fish run, written by the tree out of material a salmon carried inland under its own power and then died on top of. The salmon didn't just come home. It brought the ocean with it and left it in the forest. Pull back from the single tree now and take in the whole shape of the thing, because the unit that matters here is bigger than the fish and bigger than the forest. It's the watershed. A watershed is a simple idea with enormous consequences. It's all the land that drains to a single point. Every ridge, every slope, every seep and creek and side channel, whose water eventually ends up passing the same spot on its way to the sea. Draw the boundary along the high ground, and you've enclosed a system that behaves, in a lot of ways, like one organism. Rain falls on it, water gathers. Material moves down through it, in one direction, permanently. Everything about a watershed points downhill and outward. The mountain erodes into the valley washes into the river carries it to the ocean. Given enough time, that's a system that empties itself. And into that one-way system, once a year, comes a countercurrent made of fish. There's nothing else quite like it in a temperate landscape. Birds move nutrients around, and seabird colonies can enrich the ground beneath them dramatically, but they don't push material hundreds of miles up a river valley. Whales move it laterally through the ocean. Rain and dust move it in ways too diffuse to see. Salmon are the exception. A large, dense, seasonal, upstream-directed transfer of ocean material into the interior of a continent, delivered by animals swimming under their own power against everything gravity is doing. The historic scale of it is the part that's hard to get your head around today because almost nobody alive has seen it. Take the Columbia. Before the 20th century, historical estimates for that river's annual salmon and steelhead return run into the millions of adult fish. The commonly cited figures fall somewhere in the range of 10 to 16 million a year. And everyone using those numbers acknowledges they're reconstructions from incomplete records rather than counts. That's a system draining a substantial chunk of the American West, receiving a marine protein delivery every summer and fall, from the estuary at Astoria to spawning tributaries deep in Idaho and up into Canada. Every one of those fish was carrying ocean, and a large share of them died at the top and left it there. Now consider what's happened since. Dams on the main stems and the tributaries, habitat lost to logging, agriculture, diking, and development, a century of intensive harvest. Wild runs replaced in many systems by hatchery production, where the fish are spawned in a facility, and the carcasses are handled as waste instead of being distributed through the watershed. Runs extinct in some drainages entirely, and blocked from thousands of miles of habitat by structures with no passage at all. One assessment, looking across Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and California, tried to estimate how much marine-derived nutrient is still being delivered to those rivers, compared with what the historical runs would have supplied. Their conclusion was that the current figure is a small fraction of the former one, on the order of a few percent in the region as a whole. The authors were direct about the uncertainty in that kind of calculation, and it's a coarse estimate. But even allowing generously for the error bars, the direction is unmistakable, and the magnitude is severe. Those forests and streams are now running a deficit that nothing else is filling. And there's an ugly feedback built into it. Fewer spawners means fewer carcasses. Fewer carcasses means a thinner stream. A thinner stream means slower growing juveniles. Slower growing juveniles means smaller smolts. And smaller smolts survive the ocean at lower rates, which means fewer returning adults, which means fewer carcasses. Systems like that don't decline in a straight line. They decline and then find a lower floor and sit there, and getting back up is much harder than falling was. I don't want to leave it there, though, because that would be an incomplete picture, and it would also be unfair to what's actually still out there. Bristol Bay, in southwest Alaska, is the largest sockeye salmon system on Earth, and it is still running at full scale. Not a remnant. Full scale. In the strongest recent years, the total run has been reported at somewhere above 70 million sockeye, returning to a handful of river systems in a single summer. Figures that would have been at the high end of anything recorded historically. Those watersheds are intact, the fish are wild, the runs are managed by escapement, and the nutrient cycle I've been describing is happening there right now at a scale that would have looked normal 500 years ago. That matters, because it shows the system isn't broken as a matter of principle. Where the habitat is whole and the harvest is managed against escapement instead of a target catch, this works. It has kept working. And there's evidence that broken systems can come back faster than anyone expected. On the Elwha River, on Washington's Olympic Peninsula, 2 dams stood for a century and cut the salmon off from the great majority of their river. a watershed running out of a national park, with the habitat above the dams essentially untouched, and no fish able to reach it. Both dams were removed in the 2010s, in what was at the time the largest dam removal ever attempted. The fish came back on their own. Within a few years, salmon and steelhead were documented spawning above the old dam sites, in reaches that had been unreachable for 100 years. The sediment that had piled up behind the dams flushed through and rebuilt the beach at the river mouth. The nutrient pathway that had been severed for a century reconnected. Nobody had to teach them. There was no reintroduction program required for the fish to find that water. Straying, the small fraction of salmon that don't return to their natal stream and end up somewhere else instead, turns out to be the mechanism that recolonizes. That low background rate of navigational failure, which looks like an error at the level of the individual fish, is precisely what allows the species to occupy new rivers after a glacier retreats, or a landslide clears, or a dam comes out. The homing is what keeps a population adapted to its own river. The straying is what lets salmon exist in a world where rivers keep changing. So the watershed is where this ends, and it's the right place for it to end, because the watershed is the only frame at which any of this makes sense. Look at the fish alone, and you see a doomed animal on a pointless errand. Look at the forest alone, and you see trees growing in nitrogen-poor soil, somewhat faster than they ought to. Look at the whole basin, ridge to ridge, headwater to estuary, and out into the open Pacific where the food actually is. And you see one system with a circulatory loop running through it, and the salmon is the blood. So go back out there, middle of the Gulf of Alaska, several hundred miles from any land, 2 miles of cold black water underneath, and above it a layer of dim blue-gray where the light still reaches, and moving through that layer, a fish about the length of your forearm. Silver, blunt-nosed, heavy across the shoulder, traveling in a loose school of thousands, doing nothing you'd write down, feeding, growing, turning when the school turns. It's the same animal from the beginning, and nothing about the picture has changed. What's changed is what you can see in it. The first time, that fish looked like an animal at the peak of its physical life with 90 days to live, which made the 90 days a countdown. A very fine animal, about to be taken apart. That reading isn't wrong exactly, and it's the reading almost everyone has, and it's why the whole story tends to get told as tragedy. The noble fish, the terrible journey, the death at the end of it. Look at the same fish now and the picture reorganizes itself. That silver body is a cargo container, and the cargo is the North Pacific. Every gram of protein in it was assembled from marine amino acids that came 4 or 5 steps down the food chain, out of algae growing in cold open water, every gram of fat, the nitrogen, marked with the ocean's isotopic signature so distinctly that a laboratory can identify it in a leaf, the phosphorus that is currently in that fish's bones and will shortly be in the soil, the pigment in its muscle that will be in an egg by October. It's all loaded. It's all in transit. The route is set, a coastline it hasn't seen since it was a smolt, an estuary, a river mouth, 600 or 900 or 2,000 miles of upstream water, a canyon, a falls, a tributary off that, and finally, a stretch of gravel 40 feet long where groundwater comes up through the stream bed, and the temperature stays even in January. Those 90 days read differently now. They're a delivery schedule, and the changes coming to that body, the gills rebuilt twice, the gut dissolved, the muscle consumed, the spine giving up its mineral, the jaw grown into a hook, the immune system stood down, the hormone running to levels that would be a diagnosis in a human being. Every one of those is the vehicle stripping itself for the last leg. Weight comes off. Systems that only mattered for the return trip get shut down because there is no return trip and the design knows it. The animal doesn't know any of this. That should be said clearly, because it's easy to slide into language that makes the salmon sound like it's making a sacrifice, and it isn't making anything. There's no decision in it anywhere. There's a threshold in a pituitary gland, a cascade of hormones, an inherited magnetic map, an odor learned in a 2-week window years earlier, and a body executing an old and very well-tested set of instructions. And 40 miles inland from the gravel it's heading for, up a valley that fish will never see and that has nothing to do with anything it will ever experience. There's a Sitka spruce standing on a slope above the creek. 2 summers from now, that tree will lay down a ring, and in the wood of that ring there will be nitrogen atoms that spent this year in the open Pacific, in the body of a fish that is right now several hundred miles offshore, swimming in a school, eating, growing, with no idea whatsoever that it is already carrying them. That's what stays with me. The endurance, the leaping, the 1,000 miles. Those are the parts you can film. The part that stays with me is that a forest on a mountainside in Alaska is partly made of ocean, and the only reason is that a fish once went home and didn't leave. So, the cost. I want to be straight about it, because it's real, and I don't think it should get smoothed over. It costs the animal everything. Not metaphorically, everything. The whole body, converted, spent, left in the shallows. There's no compensation, no second season, no consolation from the fish's side of it. From where the salmon sits, if a salmon can be said to sit anywhere, the account simply goes to zero. The thing is that the accounting doesn't stop at the animal. It keeps going, out past the edge of the fish, into the gravel where the eggs are, into the insects that grow on the carcass, into the fry that hatch in April and eat those insects, into the eagle on the cottonwood and the bear in the timber and the flies in the leaf litter and the songbird nesting 60 feet up, into the soil, into the roots, into the wood, into the ring, into a watershed that has been quietly running on this delivery for longer than there have been people on this coast to notice it. An animal that dies where the river ends up feeding the whole river. There are worse ways to spend a body. If you're still here at the end of all that, I'd guess it's because somewhere in there the fish stopped being a fish and started being a system, which is roughly what happened to me while I was reading for it. If that landed A-like helps me know that the deep ones, the physiology, the isotopes, the actual mechanism instead of just the spectacle, are the ones worth making more of. And subscribing means you'll be here for the next one, because there are a lot of animals doing things this strange, and most of them get explained badly. But mostly I want something specific from you in the comments, and it's not a general reaction. Tell me your river. Whatever water is nearest to where you live. The creek behind the neighborhood, the river you drive over on the way to work without ever looking down at it, the drainage ditch that used to be a stream. Name it, and then tell me where it goes, what it runs into, and what that runs into, and whether it eventually reaches the sea. Most people have no idea. I didn't for years about the water nearest me, and if anything still comes up it, salmon, shad, alewives, sturgeon, eels, anything at all that arrives from somewhere else and goes upstream to finish something, say so, because those runs still exist in far more places than people realize. And some of them are being rebuilt right now by folks who never get mentioned anywhere. I want to see those. Every one of them is a river that still works. The fish, meanwhile, is still out there in the blue water, several hundred miles from the coast, turning with the school, feeding, growing, carrying a forest it will never stand in. And somewhere in the next few weeks, a switch it has no say in is going to close. And it's going to turn for home.